All right, good afternoon, folks. We are going to give a few minutes here for people to log on and sign in. All right, I see more and more people signing in, so that's good. I'll give it about another minute or two. All right, well, why don't we go ahead and get started? I know we have a lot to get to, so I don't want to waste any time. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Elliot Williams, and I'm the training manager at the National Press Club Journalism Institute. Thank you all for spending your time with us this afternoon. Just a few things to note before we begin. We are recording this program, and key takeaways will appear on our website and in our daily newsletter for journalists, which you can subscribe to using the link in the chat. Of course, feel free to submit questions throughout the program using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screens. Your questions will be addressed throughout the program. Immigration is one of the most complex and polarizing beats a journalist can cover today. Especially in recent times, immigration coverage has presented unique editorial challenges and has brought to light important questions, the answers to which will have lasting impacts on the journalism industry for years to come. Today, we'd like to address some of those questions, particularly those involving journalist safety and well-being, and the real-time decisions reporters and editors have to make while on assignment. Our hope is that the insights shared today will help guide your storytelling decisions. I'm pleased to welcome our wonderful panel of journalists who are directly involved in this work and bring a range of real-world experience to the table. We are joined by Adrian Carrasquillo, the national immigration correspondent and author of the Huddled Masses newsletter for the Bulwark. We have Irelis Hernandez, the national reporter covering the U.S. southern border, immigration, Texas, and beyond for the Washington Post. John Collins, senior reporter for Minnesota Public Radio, covering race, class, politics, and communities. And Michelle Zenarosa, the editor-in-chief of the LA Public Press. Thank you all for joining us today. And just another reminder that you can share questions in the Q&A function, but I'm gonna get us started with a few questions here, and then we'll get to yours. So, Michelle, let's start with you. Your newsroom kicked it into high gear seemingly overnight once you learned that ICE was conducting raids in your communities. These raids impacted some of your staff personally, and you've put together comprehensive living documents on immigration enforcement for journalists and members of the public. So from your perspective, what are some of the main takeaways for local newsrooms across the country that may face similar situations?
Thank you, Elliot, and hi, everyone. So actually, it was even quicker than overnight for us. It was hours. We got the alerts on a Friday afternoon that ICE was conducting raids in the Garment District, and the community kicked into high gear immediately, and we had to move with them. You mentioned LA Public Press. We're mostly made up of people from LA, many of us, including myself, coming from mixed status families. So as all of this is happening, we're also being directly impacted. And, in that first month, we were definitely scrambling, as the first city hit by immigration operations led by Bavino, there was really no playbook. At the same time, during the summer's operations, our audience grew over 2000% because people were actually, they were desperate for information to make decisions about their safety. We had
Mhm.
to figure out how to do this work quickly, and we found, I'll say, four things that really made a difference. The first was about building that safety infrastructure. We're a newsroom of 14 staffers, and we were pretty underprepared. I had journalists who got hit by rubber bullets, who got detained. So I looked to organizations that already had frameworks for dangerous reporting. So IWMF for risk assessment, Freedom of the Press Foundation for digital security, the First Amendment Coalition, and ProJorn for legal vetting of some of the reporting guides that you mentioned. These organizations exist for this reason, and most will work with smaller newsrooms pro bono. Second, we really had to rethink journalism's culture of competition. Local journalism is, as we can all attest, collapsing. We've lost thousands of newspapers in the last 2 decades. And when you're operating with limited resources, competing with local outlets can be kind of wasteful. If 3 or 4 newsrooms are covering the same protests, but with slightly different angles, we're wasting resources our audience desperately needs elsewhere. So, we partnered with other community newsrooms locally to try and spread the load. We did cross-city partnerships with Block Club Chicago and 51st News in DC and national publications like Capital B and the 19th. We convened over 70 journalists locally for safety training. And when we got everyone in the same room, we realized we needed to build more collective support. Um, so we organized a larger convening focused on safety protocols and editorial mapping. We even had freelancers lead a session. It wasn't really about idealism, it was just practicality,
Mhm.
honestly.
Right.
Um, we were 14, but other newsrooms and neighborhoods were like 2 or 3 people. We needed each other to keep going. And local newsrooms with dwindling resources just can't cover something this massive alone. That's just the reality. Third, I'd say build the relationships now. We're lucky we already had partnerships with other LA newsrooms when this hit. But when everything hit, those re existing relationships became sort of a lifeline. Um, and then fourth, and last, but definitely not least, we had to figure out how to keep doing this work without destroying ourselves. For the first month, we didn't take a single day off. We were unwell and we were eventually making mistakes. So we had to make changes, mandatory weekends off, which is very innovative, I know. Alternating Fridays where half the team was offline. We also had to be intentional about not only covering the trauma, we started also prioritizing stories about how communities were showing up for each other, stories of resilience and wins. Those stories kept us going on staff, and audiences also engaged more with them because people were, really drowning in bad news. And yeah, so our communities need us to be in this for the long haul, and we can't really do that if we're burning out. So that's what I'll share as my 4 takeaways.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And I love the element of collaboration. I think I just want to highlight that point because I think it's really needed right now. John, I know your newsroom has experienced similar changes and rapid pace of coverage. So, the events in Minneapolis, of course, have been a turning point for the nation, but also for your newsroom. The Associated Press described the all-encompassing immigration story as a test for the NPR newsroom in the midst of its digital transition. Can you share what this moment looks like on the reporting level? What specifically has changed for you and your team as journalists?
Yeah, I think we've been going through a digital transformation for like my entire career here so far. I mean, that's just how it goes. But I think one of the things that stands out to me, Elliot, is how different this situation is. It's almost like all these forces that we like all see coming, and especially as journalists watching our industry decline, watching fewer and fewer reporters out on the street, have seen all these different forces, like say influencers, say social media, say AI, disinformation, all kind of converge coming for us, right?
Mm,
And I think like this incidents, these circumstances in Minnesota here, where the feds essentially sent in more than 3,000 armed masked agents, have really brought home for us how different the media ecosystem is and how differently we need to approach our jobs. My my bosses, who came up in a different world, right? For them, understanding that the Homeland Security is not going to respond to your comment. They're not going to send you a statement. In fact, they will explicitly send you misleading or inaccurate information. That is a wake-up call, I think, for the people who run the industry. And it's been something that we've had to adjust to as a newsroom too. Just how do you work with a source that has proven itself over and over to not be trustworthy? What do you tell of course, you still want to be fair, like we've always been, but how do you tell your audience, hey, actually, the administration has in previous circumstances that involved fatal shootings, misled people or lied explicitly about what happened. So that's been really a learning opportunity for all of us, I think, and a way to like, in the heat of what's going on, to like forge us into to something that can move forward past 2026. Almost the like future of journalism. Like, where do we stand? And for local organizations like mine, and I will say Minneapolis and Minnesota has a great media ecosystem, but for local organizations, it's almost been like why do we exist? Who do we exist for? Do we exist for the people out here, or is there some other, like motive that we have, some higher like thing that dictated how we've done our jobs for so long. And I think for a lot of people here, I will say like I'm shocked and amazed by the work that's been done by our local organizations, all of which I know are struggling in some ways, but they're out there like with their people. And I mean, I think it almost brings us back to the roots of why journalism exists and why we do this sort of work. So in that way, it's really been, a wake-up call that I think we've needed for a while, and I'm hoping we can sustain it as we move forward.
Absolutely. A follow-up question from our audience, for you, John, and Michelle, but honestly, I think this is for all of you. When covering the ice surge in LA or Minnesota, how have you balanced coverage of breaking news along with stories of resistance or even, stories of joy or community? And why don't we go to you, Michelle, and then anyone else that wants to chime in? I think it would be good to hear from you.
Yeah, that's definitely a question we have been asking every day. I mean, I don't think there is a perfect balance. The audience, audience also loves breaking news. They want to know what's happening. But when you're constantly chasing the breaking news, there's stuff that you're missing. The bigger stories that might need more follow-up. The day two, the day three, we did. Um, 6 months in during the holidays, followed up with the first families uh, who had family members taken away in that garment district that I mentioned the first day. And so it's there's not a perfect balance. It's something that, us as editors, I'm always looking at, my content calendar for the week, and I'm noticing, hey, we have a bunch of, hard, sad stories. Let's brainstorm right now in this editorial meeting for something good, something a win, something that our audience will will keep them going.
Hmm. Absolutely. Anyone else want to answer that question?
I'll just say that like my mandate with my editors this year has been trying our best to make sure that we're telling the stories of the people at the very center of what's happening, not just the communities, but immigrants themselves. And so one of the things that for us has been really, really important is embedding as closely as possible and as safely as possible with the families. I happened to be inside a home when Greg Bovino was just outside a few steps away, walking through a neighborhood, and hopefully in telling those stories, they are sources of joy. They are stories about enforcement, but they're stories about human beings, and I think that's sort of what has been central to how we think about this kind of storytelling.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add on to what Arelis is talking about. At least for me, I always think about if I'm there for, 5 days and I want to tell these full stories. I want it to be that, as we sort of parachute in as a national reporter, that we do right by the community and we connect with the people beforehand. And so, I just think there's a, if there's breaking news, it can be almost easier in a way. Like you just sort of like run in and go do your thing. But I always think it's important that if those things don't happen in the moment, or during the time that you're there, to have like really good stories in the community and talking to, business owners and things like that, just to show the way that the policies are affecting people on the ground.
And for us, I think the breaking news, it's always going to happen. You got to keep up with it to some degree. But I've really tried to approach it by like centering our stories, like my colleagues said, in people's experiences. What happened to these people, and what does it actually mean? Which I think, like we're faced with influencers, all these other folks, social media accounts who are getting it first, right? They're getting the video, ripping the video. Who knows like where they're putting it or what context? And I think our job is to make sure that we provide that context and tell people like explicitly why it matters rather than just republishing something that's shocking or horrifying. So that's how we've really tried to approach it. And then we always try to move it forward a little bit. Like, what is the big issue that's going on right now that people are not yet talking about, or they're talking about on the streets, but they're not talking about in the state capitol? To me, that's like integral to like keeping ahead of this, and rather than just being reactive, like sometimes in mainstream journalism we can be.
Adrian, I have a question for you and then a follow-up from our audience. Your reporting earned you a spot on the White House naughty list, which on the surface may seem tongue-in-cheek, but has real-world consequences for you, your colleagues, and democracy. Tell me what it's like to report under these circumstances and how it impacts how you view journalist safety. And then I have a follow-up.
Yeah, and I think that look, we stand out probably in the media space, and among some of my colleagues here, that we are an anti-Trump outlet, right? So on the one hand, it's not surprising that there would be some sort of adversarial nature from the administration. On the other hand, to me, it's like I thought about why they were doing that. They were doing that because I reported that DHS Secretary Kristi Noem's job was in jeopardy, and they didn't like that. Well, that's been corroborated by CNN. MS confirmed our story, and then there was reporting in the new year that that was still the case, that she was under this renewed scrutiny. So, I mean, look, I think that for in many ways it just makes us want to double down and do our work when it comes to safety. It's not. I'm not saying it's because of this, but the Bulwark has a high profile online, YouTube and podcasts and things like that. And with high visibility comes obviously people who might see your stuff, who might want to go after you or target you or scare you or anything like that. We had pizzas sent to staffers in a couple instances, which is to show that they know where you live, kind of stuff. So we have our internal processes and some of that stuff, but in terms of just being careful, like we communicate when we get phishing attempts. I've gotten two texts that were from supposedly my CEO and our publisher asking, Adrian, call me. I need you on an urgent task. You know what I mean? So, like in the moment, it's so obvious, but it's also clear that you have to be careful if you click a link or if just so we just I think that communication and just staying on top of stuff. To the extent that perhaps we are a target. And so yeah, like I said, it's just something that we are aware of. But that to me tells me that we're doing some stuff right, and we can get into this. But my guiding principle this year when thinking about my journalism school, when I got into journalism, it said, we are the voice for the voiceless. And, I do not think that it ever said that we are, stenographers for billionaires. So I have wanted to do our work and to be proud of our work and to cover what's happening to real people with these policies, without fear. So.
Definitely. Did anyone else want to chime in on that? So a follow-up question. We've chatted about the difficulty involved in covering statements and press conferences from federal officials, particularly when they're telling the public that, they're not seeing things that they're seeing, right? Or they're seeing things with their own eyes that aren't happening. How do you navigate reporting on official statements and news releases at a time like this? And put another way from someone in our audience, how do you work with or report on a source that has proven itself to be untrustworthy? What choices do you have to make?
Yeah, I come at this from earlier in my career. One of my beats was when young black men were being killed by police, right? And so I would reach out to the parents of these young men, these teens, and the police statement, that was all we were going to know about their kid. And so I would ask them, do you want to tell me about your kid, your son, so that we can have that out there? And most of the time they would, as brokenhearted as they were. And so I just come at it from early on knowing that I don't really trust law enforcement statements and these numbers that they throw out. Now with this administration, you have the added effect of their entire narrative can only survive if you believe their narrative that there is a national emergency and that they have to do this and that these are all criminals. So early on, something that we're able to do that other news organizations are not going to do. But this comes from me having done this work for a long time where I like, for example, when they start saying that these guys from Venezuela are gang members, Areli works at the Washington Post. The Washington Post did amazing work looking at the fact that going through all the documents and like that these tattoos do not represent that you are a gang member. And I wanted to do that story too, but I wanted to do it from this standpoint that the tattoos are bullshit. Like the rubric that they're using and the way that they're deciding that these men are gang members is not the case. And interviewed a guy who wrote a book on it, who, MS-13 did use these types of initiations, but Tren de Aragua does not. And so I think in the buzz of the lies, and it's so hard to find the truth, that's when I think it's even more important to just cut through and really get to the heart of the matter, to be helpful and to be truthful.
Definitely.
And I'll just add to this is not something new. Our government didn't just start li
Hmm.
telling lies or mistruths. I mean, we saw what happened with the war in Iraq. Um, our job has not changed. We are still verifying, we are still fact checking. We have, in our industries, it's a roller coaster. Right now, we don't have the amount of probably staff and resources we need to really deeply fact check everything and to do the longer investigative, FOIAs and things like that. But our job has not changed. And so I'll just add that.
Definitely. We have a question from the audience. How do you gain an immigrant family's trust? And where do you go to find families who are willing to talk, but are at the center of immigration raids right now? Michelle, do you want to start? And then Ariel, if you could add.
Yeah. Where do you go? I think the biggest, I mean, if you don't have trust in the community, you need to build trust with the organizations who do have trust with them. Do not break that trust. We had a situation where a legacy media outlet, named someone and gave their immigration status, and they came to us and they were upset, and we created a tool that we shared with everybody on a bilingual card on how to talk to media after that community member came to us in fear. So we created a card similar to the red card that people were sharing around about what to say to agents, but our card helps people to understand what they're consenting to when talking to media, what journalists can and can't promise, what questions sources can refuse to answer. Um, and so I think, just building that trust, it's not quick and fast. I mean, they have it's very they have a lot to fear, and there's a lot at stake. So yeah.
Definitely. Ariel, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, no, again, trust is key, and it's perhaps a little bit more challenging for a national reporter because you're not embedded in a community and constantly sort of refreshing these relationships all the time. You're in contact with thousands of people, all the time, giving them a little bit of your time every day, and so it's particularly challenging. Nonetheless, like super, super important, at least for me. The what has always worked for me is that I do have some standing relationships in various communities where I'm feeding into the folks who are like, I don't want to say gatekeepers, but they're kind of like the guardians of the community, right? And I spend time having dinners with them. I spend time before I get to the point where I'm actually like talking to a family who is aware of the risk, who's aware of my presence, and with whom I'm constantly giving off ramps to say, you can say no, you say no, like we don't have to do this. I think recently what we did in New Orleans was that, sit down and talk with these guardians of the community, the abuelas, priests, community leaders, and showing them who we are. And, sometimes it works out and sometimes it doesn't. And you have to like just be okay and respect people's agency as well as their boundaries when it comes to this type of storytelling, because they're taking the greatest risk, not you as a reporter. And being aware of those power dynamics is essential to building that trust. It's incredibly challenging, and I could get more into it, but I didn't want to take away from the many important questions that we have coming. And Michelle answered it perfectly anyways, so.
Well,
No, thank you.
I would just love to add that, Adelise knows I love to do this. She's so good and she's been doing this for a long time. So she has those long-standing relationships. When I think about myself, I think about early on in my career when I had to go cover for the first time like a Republican winter meeting. And I was like, I don't know any of these people. And most of them are white conservatives and Republicans that I don't know. And I found like the one Mexican guy in the room, and he sort of opened it up for me, for everybody else. And then he introduced me to people, right? Because I'm thinking about younger folks here who are saying, like, well, how do you build this base if you don't have it? Now at this point, I feel as a national reporter, if I don't know someone, I know someone who knows them. And, I do get to talk to those gatekeepers and the people in the community. And then we have that trust, and people know some of the stuff that I'm doing, or we have mutual friends. And so then there's that sort of, they trust them. So then, okay, we'll take a chance with you, because to do that work, I mean, I will say that when I did this story, Love in the Time of Self-Deportation, I found actually people on Reddit who were telling their stories anonymously. And so then you have to tell them, your story is amazing. Would you be willing to? And then we can protect certain things. We can use only their first name. For some people, I've used a fake name, Maria or something, because they're scared, and we take photos, of their hands on their documents because we're not showing their faces and things. So there's always ways, but if ultimately we're just trying to tell those stories, there's ways to do it.
You've talked about safety of your sources, which is incredibly important. I do want to get a bit into safety for the journalist, physical and digital. At least last time I saw you speak, you were on assignment, as you often are, and you mentioned a field safety kit you had with you. Can you tell us a bit about what's in your safety kit and how it helps you in real world situations? But also, if there are any drawbacks or limitations to that, and of course, if any other panelists want to add to that, I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, I will preface it by saying I am an old school national breaking news reporter, and so hurricanes, earthquakes, fires, everything you can think of. There's been some close calls, so some of this has been learned through like hard lessons of experiencing very, very close calls. And I brought some props. So my trauma kit always has one of these, which is a tourniquet. You just never know what kind of situations you'll run into. And I know it sounds scary, but a tourniquet can save your life, can save somebody else's life. And when I'm out there, I'm constantly thinking about like what I need to make myself safe, of course, but I'm first thinking about what I need for other people in that situation, right? Because like if they're safe, the probability is that I will be safe in that situation too. More recently, we've had to get these. This is a Faraday bag. I had a recent experience with ICE agents in New Orleans, where I'm pretty sure they got into my phone. And part of that was because I foolishly had my Bluetooth and my Wi-Fi open. No, don't do that. Don't do what that at least did. If you can, put your phone in airplane mode or put it in one of these if you don't necessarily need your phone with you at that particular time. There are different like models you can use. This key is like, so that it seals, so that it blocks incoming and outgoing signals into your phone. like emerge. I know it sounds silly, guys, but like this could really save your life if you're out there covering, a protest, or you're just running around and you don't have time to stop anywhere. These things have saved my life more than once, where I've like almost went into a deep panic because I hadn't eaten. And unfortunately, that's happened to me quite a bit with the work that I've done in the past. And I do want to sort of broach the issue of hostile environment training. I know that's not always an option for everyone. I'm a veteran of 3 hostile environment trainings where they teach you things like, what to do if you're kidnapped. And I know that some of that sounds really extreme, but it really isn't. More and more in our country, like the kinds of things that war correspondents learn how to do to protect themselves and their crew are the same kind of things that we're going to need to do on our streets. There are opportunities. I think IWMF, the Women's Media Foundation, does offer hostile environment training. I took it right before I went to Venezuela in 2019. It became very essential while I was out there as well. So I want to do a plug for that if you can, join a sort of a consortium or one of these grant programs to be able to take a hostile environment training, because it's the kind of thing that you never know could make the difference. Learning how to pack a wound. I know how scary this sounds, but it's better to be prepared than to find yourself in a situation where you might need, some kind of expertise or some kind of training to pop into the situation to save you or someone else's life. And finally, just like girding yourself emotionally. Fortunately or fortunately for me, I've had a lot of run-in with highly, highly traumatic emotional stories. Most recently, covered the Uvalde school shooting. And it was I don't have to say it was difficult. I think everyone knows how difficult that was. Girding yourself emotionally is really, really important. You're never going to protect yourself completely from the things that are happening. And sometimes what you're feeling can power the journalism as well, as long as you're vetting it and checking, what you're feeling. But decompressing with colleagues afterwards, or with loved ones or people that who can sympathize with you or understand a little bit of where you're coming from, is deeply, deeply important. There needs to be a wind down period after you're in these highly intense, emotionally charged situations. One, to process, to begin that process. I'm a slow process myself. I'm in the zone for 2 or 3 days. I get home and I crash, and I'm like unusable for 3 days emotionally after that. But you do want to sort of jumpstart that process and to think through how you're going to manage what comes after.
Thank you so much. And I just want to say, like, your vulnerability, I think, does add to the story at times. I listened to your podcast describing your coverage of Uvalde, and your vulnerability added to that. But, definitely taking care of yourself. There are limitations to what you can bring with you. Some of that has to come from how you take care of yourself. Along those, and thank you for bringing the props. All right, Alice, I really appreciate that. Along those lines, we have a question from the audience, and I think John, I'd love if you could get to this. I'm in a small newsroom in Minnesota and am doing the majority of our ICE coverage. How do I balance providing readers with the best coverage possible while also taking care of myself?
As far as coverage, I'd say find your niche. What can you do that other people aren't already doing? Like Michelle was saying earlier, news organizations historically have overlapped way too much. And I think they've also focused too much on, people in power. So what is the mayor saying about this? What's the governor saying about this? I think that matters a lot less than, the actual like you know, sh reporting you do on the street, where you actually meet people and talk to them and find out what their actual experiences are. So I just recommend that you kind of focus on trying to find the things that you can do that no one else is doing, that distinguish you and also serve the community. And then was the second part of the question, Elliot?
And how do you take care of
Oh,
yourself
how
in
do
the
you
midst
take care?
of
Well, that's
that?
something I think we're all still in the process of figuring out. I mean, in our newsroom here, we were, of course, in the middle of George Floyd. George Floyd was killed, less than a mile from where I'm at right now, and so a lot of us who've been around for a while, had experiences during that where not only was the world in chaos, but our neighborhood was in chaos. And so I always tell people, you Journalism's awesome. You need to do it, but you need to find other things that you care about. You need to maintain your connections with people. You need to not burn yourself out because people need you. And you want to like do the work that is meaningful to you. That's why you're here. You're here for these hard moments. So just make sure that, I do a lot of like gardening. I have a lot of like other hobbies outside of journalism, and I think that's the only way that you can really stay sane.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that, like, you know, when I'm not doing immigration coverage, I started doing salsa dancing, and I'm doing that literally like all the time that I'm not doing immigration. But I would also add, along the lines of a lot of the amazing stuff that I already said, taking care of your mental health. Like, there's moments in a story where I'm like, I can't feel this right now. I have to listen to them and do that. There's moments where I let some of it in, almost like opening up a valve, and because, like Arely said, it does help the story. And there's times like headed to Minneapolis, I was just like, this is a lot. And there's a lot when it comes to, run-ins with ICE agents and different things and talking to people in the community. And I talked to my therapist about it, and he had this great thing about sort of like the spiritual resilience that we build in the things that we like to do allows us to do the hard things in our life. And that sort of reframed for me my trip. And I started asking people what was their spiritual resilience, what was their thing that was getting them through this, and what was their happy space. And so I think we do these stories, and we know that sometimes we have to say, like, this is scary and this is sad, and I'm going to tell this story so people know it. And I'm going to transfer that feeling to you from the story. But then also you can find a beautiful small story, a positive story, and that can show you how the community is responding as well.
Absolutely. There's some really great questions from the audience, so I'm going to make sure we try to get to more of them. So, when covering topics that also affect reporters, so for example, this newsroom has reporters who are Latino and have undocumented family members. How can we hold ourselves accountable to ensure our own biases don't drive or sway our stories? And how do we sort of maintain a sense of commitment to reporting the facts?
I want to push back a little bit on the framing of that question. I think, the idea that being personally affected somehow compromises the commitment to the facts. I don't think that's true. Community-centered journalism is not less rigorous than the traditional model. If anything, it's more accountable in some instances because we're not parachuting in, getting the story and leaving. For us, me at LA, I live here, our families are here, and if we get something wrong, we're facing our neighbors at the grocery store. And, that creates a different kind of accountability than distance can. Being from the community means we're understanding the stakes and the context that maybe outsiders miss. We know, which neighborhoods have mixed status families. We know the difference between a workplace raid and a targeted enforcement. We know when officials are lying because we can verify it through our own networks. I don't think that's bias, that's expertise. And we're still maintaining the same accuracy and verification standards as any newsroom. We fact check. We're using multiple sources. We get legal review on our reporting. But I really want to reject that myth that distance equals objectivity, and the idea that you have to be disconnected from a community to report on it fairly. Just it doesn't really hold up, frankly.
Yeah, and I would add to what Michelle is saying, which is that, um, I've seen stories in the past. I'll never forget this political story that just always pissed me off, where they said that they were it was like established journalists on background saying that Jorge Ramos was an activist, and I was like, well, our news judgment, she shines the light on the Hispanic community. When I see some big names in journalism sometimes, it's very obvious to me that their sources are white centrist and moderate senators, white men. So, like, to me, that's your news judgment. You're shining your light and choosing to elevate those voices. So when we choose to elevate the voices in our community, that to me is not bias, and that to me is not activism.
Well said. I want to get into just another safety question here, and just about your rights as a journalist. How do you handle interactions with law enforcement or federal agents on the scene. We're seeing all these scenes in Minneapolis, and I just imagine a journalist in another city who is preparing for the potential of having to be out there themselves. So, what are reporters' rights? What boundaries should journalists be prepared to assert? And importantly, is there anything reporters can do when agents flout existing laws and regulations? How do you address those situations?
This is, totally what we're dealing with on the ground here right now. I mean, you have constitutional rights, you have rights in theory, and then you have rights in practice. And what's on the ground here is that ICE and the federal agents are not respecting those rights in practice. You can know what all your rights are, that you're here to observe, you're practicing the First Amendment, but if these ICE agents who no one is going to punish for this want to smash your car window and drag you out, then they're going to do it. There's no repercussion for them to do that. Um, so, I mean, I think it's important to think about this, that like, and they tell people who are observing here now, this too, you have these theoretical rights, but we can't promise that the federal government is going to respect them. So, we take the common sense sort of approach of, keeping our distance from situations. I keep an eye on the police certainly, but also I keep an eye on the community and protesters who might show up, just because you never know where something's going to come from. And then, I mean, you can, of course, your newsroom, if you're big enough, you probably have access to an attorney. And I'd say that's probably the best you can do is if you get taken or if you get put in jail, stay calm and make sure you contact the attorney and put pressure on them. I think when people see journalists arrested, they think, why are they getting, or they think, why are journalists on the scene? Why are journalists getting special treatment when I'm seeing citizens next to me getting blasted with pepper balls? Um, and I think us being out there in the community and also being subjected to the similar things as citizens, because we all know journalists are just super, we have the same rights as any other citizen. And, you know, it's, like with the recent arrest that we had of journalists here in Minnesota. I mean, when people see that happen, it brings home for them what's going on. So not to say that we should center ourselves as the news, but I think it's instructive to the public to see when journalists are, we had tons of journalists who were injured and, later sued after George Floyd. And the state patrol, et cetera. And I assume the same thing will be happening here. And I think it's helpful for the public to see that we're out there with them being subjected to the same exact things.
I just
Yeah.
want to add to as a leader in the newsroom having to come up with policy and making sure we have plans when things go awry. John mentioned, talking to our legal counsel. Not every newsroom has that, particularly larger newsrooms, but a lot of the questions came up, even with our legal counsel early on about, should we identify ourselves as press, when there's a big action, when we started noticing that they were actually targeting press. So, what's safer for us? What to do when they're actually, we noticed that they were taking, some of our reporters' pictures. What do we do about that? And our legal counsel had told us, I'm not gonna counsel you to not identify yourselves and to not wear your press vest, because that might be what you have that's safe out there. But also, you have to use your situational awareness and your smarts to, save your life. I mean, like we had Ruben Salazar here who was killed. Years ago, and it can happen. So we have to think about some of that, just being aware of what's around you and making split second decisions for your safety.
Just trusting your gut in some ways.
I'll just add
Um,
one more thing, just like
yeah,
so from like just years and years of covering this stuff, not everyone's going to be able to afford a bulletproof vest or Kevlar helmet or any of those types of things that are very useful in those situations. But what you can do is understand that if you do find yourself in a situation where the ICE agent or the Border Patrol agent is just going to arrest you and take you into custody, use a marker or pen to write the attorney's name on your arm or on a piece of clothing that you sort of have inside of you, because they will take your phone, and you won't have access to your phone. And the other thing I would say, folks, like take Face ID off your phones, because you don't want to make it any easier for them to try and snoop inside your devices. A 6-digit passcode is probably the safest. It takes them the longest to crack that. So just a couple of practical things that if you do find yourselves in a situation, which more and more seems inevitable these days, there are practical steps you can take to continue to protect yourself.
And from a digital safety perspective, I know MLS you shared ways to prevent an agent from hacking into your phone. Adrian, I'm curious from your perspective, as I know you do travel for reporting stories, but I know you do a lot of your work remotely. How do you protect your information, your sources' information? Are there ways that you're able to share in terms of digital safety and some of your top, ways of protecting them? Oh, sorry, you might be. Yep, you're muted. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah. One thing that I was thinking earlier during our conversation, is, if your address is online and making sure that you can take it down from different websites. And we had a legal training recently where we went through, various different things and just like ways to be smart and understanding that we might be a target during this time, as journalists. Um, in terms of protecting sources, I think that it's just a conversation that it's always been, and I'm more aware now. I covered, immigration, the immigration reform fight, um, but spoke to like a lot of dreamers and a lot of undocumented folks, a decade ago, and longer actually, 2014, 2015. So I was familiar with people who might want to talk and their stories are powerful, but wanted to be careful. That's only gotten worse in really scary ways where activists are not wrong to feel that they're going to be targeted. We see this happening now. And so I think just like talking to folks, there's times that I make some decisions where, an activist I was talking to was telling me that her parents are undocumented. And so through some of the quotes that she's saying that, these fights are personal, you don't necessarily know, but I don't really need to include it. Whereas like I always came from a place where I want every detail. I want anything that's going to make it more powerful. But now I always lean towards protecting the person. Obviously, some of this stuff you can have conversations, and it might be the reason that they don't want to speak to you. There was one recently where I wanted to speak to a dreamer activist who was basically telling me they've never been more scared in their life. So I understood that, we when we spoke on background, how careful we had to be. But other times I'll just leave stuff out of stories that I don't necessarily feel that they need to be in there, if it can leave a few more details about a person out.
For sure. We have time for a few more questions, so I want to get to more audience questions here. There have been several cases where the administration's official account of an incident is different from what people on the ground experienced. In situations where, there isn't immediate eyewitness video available, what methods are the best to tell what's accurate and a complete account? And in other situations, how are you verifying some of those videos and photos? And that could be for anyone.
Yeah, I always think, especially now, but from for a few years now, is that accountability needs to not be a second day story. It needs to be the first day story. And especially with how quickly the Trump administration has brought out their narratives. Multiple high-ranking officials, talking about Renee Good being a domestic terrorist within, 16 hours of her being killed. And so, like, I think at the same time as like, a newsroom like mine would have been, okay, let's figure out the name of who lost their life here. We should also be putting together at least what we can of the videos, of course, looking at metadata, et cetera, to be sure that those videos are verified, but also talking to direct witnesses who can vouch for what's in the videos. And then try doing the best we can to present the most accurate narrative about what's going on, so it doesn't get overwhelmed by the administration's social media and media firepower. We just need to jump on it right away. I can't wait until the next day anymore.
A question for you, Adrian, from our audience. How are you able to shape your coverage differently working for an expressly anti-Trump publication like Bulwark? And this is from a longtime subscriber.
Yeah, I think that I have always tried to understand that if I do the same thing everyone else does, why would you read my story? This came from me early on when I started covering immigration, and I'm like, well, how am I supposed to be competing in a way with the Associated Press or Reuters when they have these amazing stories? So I was just like, I needed to come with different angles, and early on in my career, that was elevating the voices of activists that were knocking on the gates of the White House with their activism. And as I've gotten older, I think a lot about the framing of a story and the headline, and what that immediate impact has of somebody. And yeah, we can be a little bit more direct with our language, and we can be a little bit more, adversarial, and we can say, everybody wrote about Liam Ramos, and everybody understood how horrifying that was. But we can go a little bit deeper, and in terms of being a little bit more voicey on what this means and what this means for our country. And again, actually, the Washington Post art and architecture critic, yeah, was he had, I think, to me, the piece of record on the photo and how powerful that photo was. And so then I took a lot of that, and about what he was saying about the images of children and their innocence and what that means for us as a country right now. If we're not standing up to fight for that, like, we're lost, right? And so there's things where I feel that I can just be a little bit more direct. And during this time where there is so much covering up and saying that we're lying, there was an interview recently that was, I don't even know if unearthed, it just sort of like re-popped up in our digital world. And it was a journalist saying to Trump when the cameras had gone off, like, why do you do that? Why do you constantly attack the media? Like, what do you do? And he was like, well, I don't want them to believe you when you write negative stories about me. This guy's been in our life for 10 years. This isn't some shocking, surprising thing that's happening. So when our credibility is being attacked and when we're being attacked, we have to do a good job in all the ways that everybody has said today. But I think that we can also try to get at stuff that the old way of looking at things of just like there's objective and we have to put in this side. Sometimes I don't want to put in the sort of like the to be sure paragraph, because I want to get at what's really happening and tell like a really direct story.
Thank you. Michelle, I think this would be a great question for you. Someone wants to know which non-journalism organizations and networks have been most key in reaching and informing communities, and how have you collaborated with them in your reporting? And I'm curious, maybe even before the story we're covering now, if there are non-journalism organizations you've partnered with.
Non-journalism organizations. I think locally here, a lot of the immigrant community organizations, and then rapid response networks, definitely
Mhm.
getting in there and seeing what's going on is really important. Haven't had a lot of time to do other big
Yeah.
partnerships with non, not other newsrooms or organizations like I named them, but that also give resources. I mentioned IWMF. They also
Mhm.
help secure giving us funding to build out some of our safety kits, and Freedom of the Press Foundation, who also gave us who are doing digital hygiene auditing for us pro bono. Yeah, I mean that's my honest, real question.
No,
I
definitely,
mean, answer.
definitely. And I know you mentioned partnerships earlier with other
Yeah.
newsrooms, so and I know people wanted to know a bit about that. Does anyone else partner with or work with non-journalism organizations to reach communities or verify anything? And while you
There,
think
so
on, oh,
there,
go ahead.
I was just gonna say we know very little about like who ICE is taking into custody and where they're putting them, etc. There are some folks who've worked on the data side who are not journalists explicitly, who've done like really good work. I'm going to get the website wrong, but deports or something like that.
The
Anyway, they're great.
Deportation Data Project.
Yes, that's right. Right.
Hmm.
Yeah. So, I mean, we've had to rely on some of those, and then, of course, academics as well, who've been like looking at this forever, and then policy folks who have been following the immigration policy debates over the years and can actually tell us what the impact of some of these legal decisions that we're seeing come out almost every day now are on people on the ground.
Elliot, do you mind if I help you do your job here with two questions that I saw that maybe I could like just take
Please, please,
a
absolutely. Please
little quick
address
stab
that.
at?
Yeah.
Well, I saw one about video journalists, and let me just be clear, I'm not a video journalist, and I like was doing video in Minneapolis for the first time maybe since journalism school. But that aside, like, when we're talking to people and we're trying to get a business owner, I've gone to places where the people who work there are like, I'll give you a first name, because they're scared. So now I'm like, well, how the hell am I going to get? And I mean, honestly, like I was able to get an Ecuadorian business owner in Minneapolis just by sort of saying like, look, I'm going to write this, but also do you mind being on the video? And he was really moved by what happened to Renee Good, so he wanted to be on video. So I think just like you'll be surprised sometimes is all what I wanted to mention there. And then I thought the one about are there parts of the immigration enforcement system that reporters know exist but cannot meaningfully report on due to access restrictions like ICE facilities? How do we get information on what's going on inside these facilities? But an extremely difficult story. I wanted to do one on LGBT detainees in New Mexico that were being treated badly. And they all the folks involved agreed to have me be able to talk to these folks. But then midway through the story, they just pulled that and they said, you know what, this is going to endanger. We're scared. And I understand when people are scared. Like, on the other hand, what's going on in Dilley right now, where little Liam Ramos went, he's been left, he's been taken out, and then there's all these children that are there. I think that that's like a really important story going on right now, and I'm following that. And there's letters coming out, which really good stories have already been written of ProPublica and I think others of letters from the children that are coming out of Dilley and things like that. So there's stories because of the Democrats who went in there, and the lawyers and stuff. There's stories of these children, and it is a direct follow-up to the Liam Ramos situation. So that's one that like I'm jumping on because it's something that we can do. So there are ways, but it is difficult.
Definitely. I think we have time for maybe one more audience question, and then I want to end with something for a question for all of you. I really love this question. Do you have any process for following up with sources months after you've done the story to learn and ensure that they continue to be okay? I realize that pushes up against the role of journalism, but I find myself worrying and wondering sometimes about people in stories, and I think this is particularly relevant for what you all cover.
Go ahead, Michelle. I'm, this is an emotionally exhausting job. Prior to covering immigration full time, I covered the border. And so I spent a lot of time in northern Mexico with the same people who are now in our cities across the country. And one of the things that has been sort of crucial to our reporting is those early contacts with folks like me going over across the bridge with them back then and getting their phone numbers then has been crucial to the reporting now and understanding sort of the dynamics that are now at play. Uh, I will confess that maintaining those relations are extremely emotionally taxing. Sometimes because, the relationship dynamics that are true to every kind of relationship can come into play. I'm a woman. I get instantly caused like, oh, your husband lets you do this work, things like that. You have to sort of draw lines in the development of those kinds of relationships. But I also, it's sort of, I don't have a great solution to this other than staying in contact. What I found is, again, there's no way you're going to eliminate the power dynamics that exist between you, journalists in the United States, and individual, usually immigrant, who is in a much more vulnerable condition than you are. And one of the things that I found is useful is trying to make sure that what is happening is an exchange of humanity and not an interrogation from the get-go, right? Like I have shared, like immigrants will send me things and ask me to check if it's true. Families will ask me, where do I find research on enrolling my kid in school? I'm happy to do that kind of thing. And again, while also being very clear that like you're not their friend. I have recently published a story about a woman that I met last year who you might have seen in videos when their appointments at the border bridge were canceled for asylum appointments. She cried and she became sort of this image of this moment with the inauguration happening. And I happened to be in touch with the migrant shelter where she's been all this time. I lost her number because she had to change from a Colombian number to a Mexican phone number, but was able to get back in touch with her. And that's someone who, like, once or twice a day when I can, she'll video chat me just to show me like what she's doing in the migrant shelter and how she's making things better. And, and those are okay, like I think for the most part, but you have to judge sort of on how those relationships and should work. There are other relationships that I've had to cut off because they were not good for them. They were becoming dependent on me in a way that I can't
Hmm.
provide. So it's a lot like all the other relationships in your life that you have to, it's emotionally taxing, but it's about like showing up and being present and being human as often as possible.
Absolutely. So I think we're gonna wrap up here, but before we do, maybe if we could do kind of 1 to 2 sentences, keep it brief. Looking back on your experience, each of you, what's one lesson you learned the hard way about covering immigration that you wish more journalists knew going in? So someone starting out just now, Adrian, let's start with you, and then we'll go
Yeah.
around.
I would just say that like compassion and empathy are not bad things. Caring about people is your superpower. It's not some weakness. And you know, when at a time when an administration is denying people their humanity, Latinos, immigrants, but also including U.S. citizens, actually affirming humanity, um, was also the message of the Super Bowl, by the way, the halftime show. Just if anybody would like a news peg. So look, that this stuff matters and the work we do matters, especially during this time.
Absolutely. John, how about you?
I think so. I spent last year as a Neiman Fellow at Harvard, and we talked to so many smart people about what's going on in our industry, what's going on in our democracy. Um, and, I came home like super worried about what are we going to do as an industry and as a country. And, I think just this sort of coverage that we've been doing confirms to me that we need to stick to our fundamental like values as journalists, and we need to not be afraid to share what our values are, that we care about accountability, we care about transparency, we care about democracy, we care about equity, and not just shy away and say, hey, this is there's some sort of objective truth that only we are privy to. I just think, if anything, it's reinforced for me that we need to get back to our fundamentals and to, supporting our communities through our work.
Most definitely. Alice?
And I wanted to give a big shout out to local journalists who have stepped into the breach and done a phenomenal job covering their communities in a way that national outlets cannot and will not be able to do. So thank you for what you all do and the depth and the care that you've brought to it. Three things. One, resist the easy narratives. I'm sorry, there aren't heroes and villains here. They're just people. And as much as, we see or want to see the world in certain ways, there are surprising stories when we flip our own perspectives and our own understandings of how these things are at play on its head and like play that game with ourselves. I know it's a little bit of like intellectual hula hooping that you're doing, but I think it's worth doing the exercise and seeing you might be missing. And three, quoting my colleague Maria Sacchetti, one of the best in the business, is that every time you think you know and you understand how immigration law is supposed to work, you don't. It just the administration, it keeps finding places within immigration law where there's enough of a question for them to implement a policy that is, for the most part, on shaky but not completely like discarded legal justification. So like don't assume you understand anything about how this is supposed to work because it's being reinvented all the time.
Most definitely. Michelle, final thoughts?
Um, Final thoughts. I think, the lesson I learned the hard way is that we can't do this work alone. And I really mean that on multiple levels. We can't do it alone as a newsroom. We tried, we couldn't cover everything. We couldn't be everywhere. We couldn't get every story. In the beginning, it really nearly destroyed us. So collaboration is not optional. We really need it to survive. And we can't do it alone as journalists either. The toll is really real. We're all affected. And they're covering stories about their families, their neighborhoods. And if we don't build those support systems and give people permission to step back, then we'll lose folks. And then something that I'm still grappling with is I really think our industry is failing freelancers. They're doing the dangerous work with us, and we don't have sustainable ways to protect them. There's no safety equipment, no legal backup, no mental health support. So we need to figure out how to extend those protections beyond our staff because right now we're asking people to take the same risks for really a fraction of the support. I wish someone told me in the beginning, it's a marathon, it's not a sprint. We have to pace our team. We have to say no to stories. We have to prioritize sustainability over being first. Our communities, they really need us to be here a year from now, 3 years from now, and that is only going to happen if we're taking care of each other. And that includes the freelancers who are on the front lines with us.
Thank you so much. That was a really great point to end on. Thank you so much. I can't thank our panelists enough. I feel like I could just learn from you. I wish we had more time for your insights, but thank you for joining us. And to our audience for great questions. We'll share a link to the recording soon, along with resources shared during this webinar and more. The National Press Club Journalism Institute is proud to produce programs like this at no cost to journalists across the U.S. with the mission of powering strong journalism in the public interest. If you'd like to support this work, we hope you'll consider making a donation today. And please spare a few minutes to fill out a survey to tell us how we did and help us improve our programming. Thank you again for joining us, and we hope to see you again soon. Take care, everyone.